Awesome. Now it's time for the Festival of David. It was pretty extraordinary looking at that. With the benefit of knowledge that you have now, and you confessed you're 78, what piece of advice would you give to your 22-year-old self?
If you believe in it, do it. I think the sort of work that I've tried to do, and a few of my colleagues, is passion. And to go that extra mile, if it's safe to get it. But do it the best you can in a decent way.
We're too polite. We can't hear at the back.
Ah, rightio. Okay. Perhaps...
Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
Sorry.
Microphone technique.
Yeah. What I was saying is that what Sabra just asked me, what would I do if I was back at 22 or whatever? Obviously, one makes mistakes in life, and I think that I was more in love, or became more in love in my work than what I did with people that were close to me, and I regret that in many ways. But with me, it really became a calling. Hopefully, to try to make people aware of what is going on. And I was fortunate enough to have the ABC and SBS who would use this stuff or want to do this type of thing, because it's important. Where, of course, on the commercials, they wouldn't do too much of it because it's not rating. It's different. It's a different thing altogether. Looking back at that film now and seeing it put together, it makes me think it's really worthwhile, particularly what's going on in the Ukraine now, and that's what we were doing all those years ago.
Yeah. We'll get to Ukraine in a tick because I'm keen to hear your thoughts about that. We saw some pretty extraordinary scenes there, you being able to direct helicopters to help you with your cinematography, stopping those tanks from going forward because you had a jam with the camera. You could never really imagine that happening these days, could you?
No, you couldn't. But because it was all reasonably pretty new then. Still, I mean, it might have been going 10, 15 years. But with that particular thing, as Neil Davis said, no one ever went out with the poor old South Vietnamese. And they were doing most of the fighting. So they were. When we arrived, they were so pleased. Welcome, as I said there. Yeah. And they want to show what they were proud of what they were doing. So when the camera jammed, I think it was pretty well set up. There was a Viet Cong place there, but they knew what was going on, so they waited till we got ready again because they wanted to show us what they were doing.
You're definitely not a gung-ho kind of person. I think respect and humanity underline your work ethic, but who you are even away from the camera. Is that a fair summation?
I do try to be. The camera to me is just an extension, like a microphone probably is to you, Sabra, an instrument we use to tell stories. That's what it's always been. Of course, you've got to learn how to use it properly. Yes, I've always been a bit like that, and somebody I didn't notice until a year or two ago when I'd forgotten about shaking the Colonel's hand. When Mike just cleared off and Bob cleared, Bob's lost out, and I was just in the battlefield shaking the Colonel's hand, it's because that's the way I was brought up to do, I think. But it is important, you were going in other people's territory and into their lives. I think I don't like cameras being jabbed in or pushed into my face.
Did you ever fear for yourself?
Yes, of course, all the time. You just don't know. It's not like these wars that are particularly going on now. They're not like conventional Second World War or something like that. It's not that you're going to be rocketed or whatever. It's just the fear of not knowing. I mean, even then, a sniper could get you from 300 or 400 yards away. And those M16, if you've got a bullet that John Wayne, sorry. I mean, when he got shot in the arm, but the power of the bullets, the shock kills you, it'll take your arm off. So you're always worried that you're going to walk on a landmine, or a sniper's going to get you. You just don't know, and it is tremendous tension, particularly with me. I'm so concentrated in what I'm doing. I'm looking around everywhere, seeing what's what's happening. But anybody says you don't get frightened in wars, I don't think they're telling the truth.
We had a question sent in from someone who can't be here tonight, John Rodstead. He said it's both an observation and a question for you. You've had a long, productive and exceptional career and put humanity to many of the dark spots of the past 50 plus years. My question is there a time when you felt you needed to slow down or change direction or stop? And he says, and then he also partly answers his own question too by saying, firstly, I think age has nothing to do with it, it's a mentality. What do you think?
Well, I mean, if I was fit enough, I mean, I would love to go and do something behind the scenes in Ukraine right now, but something special, something about the people. But after seeing me fall down here, I don't think I'm up to that, but I did go to Afghanistan when I was 70. And the American colonel who I was embedded with his battalion, I got to know him very well, a terrific bloke. He came to me one day and his wife had been on the phone to him from the States and he came to me and said, Dave, I said, yes, so Bob, he said, my wife asked me to ask you, why would you want to go to a war at your age? You know, and I thought about that, God, I'm getting on a bit. But, you know, it's the work. Well, I don't call it work, it's more than work, it's having the opportunity of educating and showing other people what goes on in these places.
In your time too, you talked about, when we saw in the documentary, sending film back to be processed and handled and edited back in Hong Kong or Sydney. Now, when you look at Ukraine, cameras are there, we're seeing it 24/7, you can flick on the TV at any time almost, you can see it. You can watch it on social media, like it's pervasive.
Mm.
Do you worry about that? I mean, there are some people in, you know, there is a cohort now of news avoiders who think, I just see too much of that and I can't anymore, I'm not going to watch, listen or read.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's become so commercialised. And I mean, CNN, I mean, it made its name on covering the first Gulf War because it was all sort of live. Thank God for programs like Four Corners. Sarah and Tony and Ryan Sheridan, who filmed it, went and did that piece. We're trying to explain the other side of things. So we've got programs like that we can still do that. But what worries me is this 24-hour news cycle. It's just churning it out, the same old stuff. You hear somebody in America say the same thing that somebody in Ukraine has said it, and to me, I think it's just too much. And I think it's important to show emotion, but all the time, I mean, it does get a bit repetitive.
And negative and doom and that cycle.
Without the positive, because there are wonderful people doing wonderful things, but to get that balance right, and I think it's very dangerous for journalists and filmmakers. And as I told you, I was telling somebody that John Little, who wrote the book on my life, his son, Jeremy, was a sound recordist for NBC. And he was sent out to cover the Iraq War, and a CBS crew had gone up the road because a car had blown up. They got a call from New York saying, why aren't you up there? You know, we've got to beat them to get it. I mean, what's that got to do with it? So they went up, they stopped at a checkpoint, somebody threw a grenade in the car and killed Jeremy. Just because it's all this competition, which it's getting away from the point of journalism, I believe, from my experience, and I think, you know, it's not worth that just for a shot of a car blowing up. And that worries me, where it's all heading in the news business.
Talking about the positives, and it's, you know, it's war, it's brutal. Civilians are losing their lives, and they are the ones that are suffering the most.
They're the ones.
But the positives. We're seeing in Europe people driving hundreds of kilometres to offer rooms in their homes.
It's bizarre, isn't it? It brings the best out in people.
We're seeing enough of that kind of coverage in the world?
I think if you look on the right programs, people like, I think the BBC particularly, what I've been observing, they've got some very seasoned correspondents who have been, and camera people, who've covered a lot of wars in the Middle East, and they're doing some superb stuff, trying to show that side of the goodness of people. You know, it shouldn't happen in the first place, but it does. but I think there's some good stuff coming out about that, showing the humanity of people. But again, I think it's just full of it. And I think there's far too much that people can take in. That's why people, I think, agreeing with you, are turning off.
Mm. It can be quite overwhelming. What is your advice to people who find it all overwhelming?
Turn it off. Because I think people have got... I mean, the world we live in is a pretty tough place with what's been going on in the last few years with the virus and things like that. I think it's good to watch good news programs or listen to good news programs. But I think it overwhelms people, and you've got enough normal things about just living day to day properly. And I think it's something where the media has got to look at it. But this 24-hour news cycle is something I think can be in the long run quite dangerous for society.
When you see how technology has changed news and news current affairs over the past 10 years, do you wonder what it might be like in even 10 years' time?
Well, I do. I don't know what it'll be. But I mean, as we were talking earlier, that this morning, that a very highly regarded war correspondent, Martin Bell, for the BBC, and Bob and I know quite well, and he gave it all up because he'd fly into a country, and as soon as he got there, all the questions were there for him. Stand on a soapbox and only just arrive there without having a chance to research as a foreign correspondent. And that worries me, but it's this whole immediacy of the technology, I believe, is driving the, particularly news, is driving the work.
In 1980, you were the first producer cameraman for the ABC in Moscow, which also brings me to another interesting point about the Ukraine war. We're hearing little glimpses too of what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Moscow. Protests, the young producer who stood up behind that bulletin with her...
Fantastic.
Yeah.
How brave.
Incredibly brave. Do you wonder what it's like for sane Russians at the moment there?
Oh, it must be horrible. I mean, I went into... When I got to know Russian families, they were all very suspicious because of the KGB and communism, in the sense of not worrying what they should say, particularly to my day, particularly to foreigners, because they didn't have much to do with foreigners. I mean, I was followed all the time by the KGB. But when you got into their homes and got to know them, they're the most fantastic, wonderful, passionate people. And I wonder what they're thinking with all this. And you see not just the death the horrible death and the suffering of people, but the destruction of some of these most beautiful cities in Europe going. And that war, I believe, will die out, or they'll all get too tired of it, or something will happen, like what happened to Yugoslavia, or whatever, and then we move on to the next one. But we can't seem to really stop and really have a good look at it as human beings and do something about it. The Americans have only, I think, not been at war in something like 25 years of their whole existence, the United States. I mean, anything about that. And as General Eisenhower said, President Eisenhower, and he's a military general, watch out for the industrial military complex back then. And I think it's got too big. I'm being a bit doom and gloom, but I think it's they've got to make all this stuff to make money for capitalism.
You, Neil Davis, terrific Tasmanian cinematographers. Peter Curtis is here. And I know that you prefer to call yourself a cinematographer, not a camera operator, because it is a craft.
Yes. Well, an operator to me is somebody who operates, as I said, who operates a forklift truck or an old telephone switchboard in the old days. But no, I mean, a lot of the people, my colleagues do the work I do in documentary current affairs and news. It's more than just operating a camera. It's good work. It's storytelling with the camera. It really is storytelling, and the word camera operator, I think, is a disservice. There's so many Australians now working overseas, not just risking their life, but doing terrific work. And they're a bit more than Well, the reason we know the operator came in because we couldn't say cameraman anymore, obviously, and fair enough. And I think the word really is, we're all cinematographers. And thank you very much. Bit of support there. But, you know, I remember a colleague of mine who worked on Four Corners for 20 years, and he said one day to the executive producer, and this guy was a director, cinematographer in his own way, right? The credit was camera. You're not a camera. You know, it should have been director or filmed by or something, just out of respect. I mean, a doctor doesn't like to be called a medicine man or a medicine woman. And it's just, to me, and it's not a snobbish thing, it's just something that I respect as a profession and the craft, Sabra. And it's something I've been going on about all my life. And even Ray Martin said to me, don't call David Brill a cameraman or he'll go and get in a huff and sit in a corner for a week. Well, that's not quite true, but it was true what he said, but Ray said. But it's just that, you know, as we're sitting here now, there's so many people actually you never hear that out there doing all this filming. You know, you must be the reporter on the camera, fair enough. But who's behind the scenes doing all this incredible work risking their lives? Cinematographers. And I happen to be the ambassador for the Cinematographer Society, so I'm getting a plug in there.
There you go. Yep. Duly noted. Nick Bryant, ex-BBC correspondent, who's now back living in Australia with his Australian wife and family, recently wrote an article, I think about a week and a half ago, about the many talented Australian cinematographers working overseas for foreign news outlets. Why do you think it is that Tasmanians and Australian cinematographers do so well overseas?
I don't know. I think a lot of it, particularly in Tasmania, is because of Tim's book on Neil Davis, and not just cinematographers, but journalists as well. If you read so many journalists who have made it because they read Tim Bowden's book, and so they want to become journalists or foreign correspondents, and you can name a lot of them who become quite famous. I think in Tasmania, it's not just in our type of work, in journalism, I think it's because people want to get off the island and go and explore a bit. I don't say it's right, but I think it's a lot of that.
I'm reversing the trend.
You came the other way down here, I know, and we're very honoured you did with your reputation, Sabra, without embarrassing you. To move AM down here, it's wonderful. I know you came down and told me because you love looking at the mountain.
That's true. That's true. I know that you probably don't want to talk about this too much, but your decades of service have come at a personal cost, haven't they?
Yeah. You paid the price, and, you know, I grew up in a culture of, at the ABC particularly, of drinking, and I loved it. It gave me a bit of false confidence. It was great. Sit in a bar with your colleagues and discuss things, but with me it became a problem. I can't blame what I've seen onto that, and I wouldn't, but I haven't been drinking for over 20 years, but I'm sure it didn't help. Because being oversensitive can also be very selfish, and one's intellectually aware of that, but you can't change that. It's a very painful thing to be oversensitive. Mm. But in some ways, as some of my colleagues have told me over the years, it's helped me with because I can see it, and I can see it through the camera and other people, because of having that sensitivity. But it's not easy, and selfishly, as I got older, the work became more important. The type of work I do, the humanitarian work, and the great to me, the unsung heroes in this world are people like nurses, doctors, aid workers. My friend Vicky's here somewhere, and who used to be the communication manager for Oxfam, and she arranged for me to go to Somalia with the AIDS crisis there, and all this little family of four little girls. Their parents died of AIDS, and they're living in a little house on their own, washing their hands, prayers, cooking their own food, and going to bed. And it was just amazing stuff to see. And the aid workers who, you know, they're not doing it for the money. They're doing it because they genuinely care. So I feel it's my responsibility to go and show that and somehow get that on television. You know, these are the unsung heroes to me.
Yeah, I think the pandemic perhaps will also remind many of us just how important healthcare workers are, how important cleaners are.
Yeah.
They're some of the lowest paid jobs in our community, and yet they've helped keep everyone safe.
I think it's put everything back in its perspective a bit too, hasn't it? I mean, this whole thing of celebrity, worries me, because it's a false thing, as we all know deep down. I mean, but it sells newspapers, it sells magazines, and everybody's in on it. And I think in some ways it's quite dangerous, where people like aid workers and nurses and school teachers and all those are the real heroes.
Now, this has been a terrific fireside chat, and I think if you've got some questions that you'd like to ask David, yes, we've got some budding journos in the audience there, terrific. Now, I think we've got some more roving microphones.
I'm hoping that people just projecting.
Is that you, Lord Mayor?
All right, we'll take this question first and then we'll come to you. Sorry. Yes, you.
Yeah, David, thank you very much. It was an incredible film, incredible images and a beautiful narration. My question is to do with its broadcast back in Australia. With footage, say, of the Cambodian Secret War or the North Vietnamese side of it, was there any problems with the broadcaster once the footage came home?
You mean when I was shooting out for the ABC?
Yeah.
Oh yes.
Censorship.
Oh yes, a lot of stuff wouldn't be shown.
Right.
And a lot of it, and you've got to be careful with that too. I understand that, a lot of that stuff. That's why we got away with those couple of shots. But in those days, I think it's even worse now. Some of the stuff I filmed, I felt I had to film it because it showed what the Nixon's bombing did. For instance, those babies, before they were covered in the sheets, I saw them all lined up there. More than that, and also government interference too at that time into the ABC. Now, we did 4 quarter stories that the government tried to stop going to air. We had a general manager who was very keen on getting a knighthood, and that played a big part in it. But a lot of the stuff which I shot was pretty. I was going up out on that Cambodian trip when we went out, and it's very dangerous. Now, I don't want to just go out looking for bang bang, but if you're going to do a documentary or a long piece, you've got to show some war. That's what it's about at the end of the day, but not harping on it. So I'd go out. I was doing a 90-minute documentary, which I was directing and filming for German ZDF, German television. But the night before I was going out, Neil Davis invited me to have dinner with a young colonel and his wife and his 2 children at that little apartment in Phnom Penh. He was married, he was a part of the royal family. So we went around to their house, we sat on boxes, using newspapers as tablecloths, and the most beautiful food, and their manners and the way they treated Neil and I was magnificent. And the next morning, he was a company commander, and he was going out to clear the Khmer Rouge at an area. And he said to me, "Would you like to come along?" But you couldn't come with him. We had to follow. So the next morning at about 6 o'clock, in the Mercedes, with the esky and the radio, and crazy, out we go. And I said to Hung, who was Neil's number 2 driver, but he worked with me when Neil didn't need him. He was a civil engineer, but he made more money, of course, being a driver. A beautiful man. And I'd say, Hung, stop the checkpoints. Let's stop every checkpoint, please, stop. No, it's all right, Mr. David, I know. No. So after a while I said, we're about 2 hours out, and there's no one around. But we knew the colonel and his truck was in front of us. And so I'll get this out quickly. And so I said to Hung, please stop. So he stopped. I got out to ask the soldiers at the checkpoint to check on what was going up the road further. All of a sudden we heard boom, bang, and all the fighting. You hear it over the radio. What they'd done, they put a B-40 rocket into the colonel's truck. As I said, it filled in about 25 people on board this truck. I went up to this truck that had just been blown up, And here's the colonel I was having the dinner the night before with his guts ripped open on the back of this truck, and I held him, and he died there. But that didn't get to air on the German documentary because it was just, even then. But similar stuff like that with the ABC. No, we're lucky to get away with just showing that one or two shots because there's a lot of pressure on us. I mean, the Postmaster General who ran the ABC at the time, he tried to take money away, not from the ABC, but from Four Corners, because they didn't like what we were doing, and we weren't. We're not all lefties, all righties there. We're not liberals or all Labours. We're very aware of being honest and the best you can do, and that brings me to a point to finish up on, if I can. So, if you want to say something, is that with all the hassles the ABC's going through, just imagine where we'd be without it. Just imagine that. The ABC is the backbone of Australian democracy. Now, there's a lot of things you can say about the ABC at times. It's not an easy place to work with because there's too much bureaucracy. But a lot of the work I've done and Sabra, we wouldn't get it on commercial television. They wouldn't be interested because of commercialism of it. And so we're so lucky in a country of 25 million people to have the ABC and SBS. America's got nothing like it. And I'll leave it at that.
Now we're almost at time. I think we've got a couple more questions before... Two more questions before we have to wrap it up. Yes, please, sir.
David, there's two questions because one we talked
controversial.
About. One is where to from here, but I want to before you do that, David, you've been famous also in peacetime, and you single-handedly ensured that we could see Australia 2 in action because you demanded certain rights in America when the America's Cup was being filmed. So could you just...
Which one? What was
Australia 2.
About the being thrown off the wall?
When you forced your way onto...
Oh no, I didn't force my way out. A bit better than that, but I hear what you're saying. I was up in Newport as the ABC's producer, cinematographer, covering the America's Cup. One of the great fun assignments you could ever have, with Alan Bond and everybody else there. We're there for 2.5 months. Jim Middleton, reporter for ABC News. John Highfield for ABC Radio. And Bruce Stannard, who did the 7, was then the National, I think, the 7:30, same as 7:30 report. And I had to produce and film a 5-minute piece for 7:30 and a news piece every day coming off the water. And but I wanted to get down on, because the keel was the big thing in those days. Let's show us the keel, and we couldn't see it. So I'm down on the waterfront filming Australia 2, preparing and all this stuff. Well, all of a sudden, they tried to throw me off because they said, Alan Bond, I think you owned Channel 10 then or something, was it?
Channel 9.
Or had he had the, Channel 10 had the rights, I think, to the America's Cup. And I'm there, and they said, we're going to get you off here, sir. I said, why? I said, Mr. Bond said, Channel 9, Channel 10 have got the rights. So they started to manhandle me, these big bouncers, and I didn't like that. I don't like being pushed around. And so as they're pushing me out through the gates, I'm saying, I'm from the national broadcaster, the people's broadcaster, you can't throw me out, the taxpayers' money and all this stuff. I laugh at it now. So when they threw me out, there's a right there from the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Cole Adams, who was their Washington correspondent, and he heard me. So he came and interviewed me, and everybody came and interviewed me from all the Australian media. So the next morning, Alan Bond, what have you done? You're ruining my reputation, and all this. How dare you, and so we had to have a meeting for Alan Bond with him, and we calmed everything down, and I was allowed to be the people's representative on the waterfront. But that was an amazing assignment. I nearly missed the finish. I couldn't believe it. You get a bit giddy after a while when you're holding a camera and then you're out in the water all day. And I went down to have a cup of coffee because we were so far behind. Then a guy came and said, "Hey, Dave, what are you doing down here? You've just hit the front." I said, "What?" So I rushed up there and I started going across the finish. And as we're coming back into the harbour, At 4 in the afternoon, 4 or 5, the light was going down. Alan Bond gets on board Australia 2 with a cassette radio, some boxes of, is it Swan beer that he owned? Yeah. And the music from the Men Down Under. And as we're going into the harbour with the sun and that music, and we'd won. It was the most incredible experience. And then to see what was happening in Australia with Bob Hawke. You know, what was the other one, David?
What's next?
Oh, what's next? You might ask that. We'd like to do 2 more, and it really is fantastic stuff. I mean, I'm the only one who's got all of this stuff. I'm the Berlin Wall from the East German side. Well, visitors have it, but I filmed it all. And a lot of stuff, and we're doing this because we believe in it. You know, we're not doing it to make money. I mean, Bob and I have put and Rob Hazelwood, we're all a bit out of pocket, and Adam, who's here with us, filming, because we want to do it before we get too old, because we believe it's part of history. But we find it so hard to get anybody who, if it wasn't for the Judith Neilson Institute, thank you, we wouldn't have got this one done. We can't get much help here in Tassie. Andrew's tried very hard to help us from Screen Tas, which I'd love them to be involved because I'm a Tasmanian. And it's, you know, it's work that is so important. I mean, I hope in a way we've all learned a bit of this tonight watching it, particularly what's going on in Ukraine, in a way. And but we've got enough, as Bob's pointed out, to do 2 more if we can get some finance for them. Thank you for the question, Damon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you for being open and honest and bearing some of your soul.
No,
it's lovely having a chat with you.
No, thank you very much, Sabra. Thank you for coming and living in our country.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabra, very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Don't forget AM tomorrow morning, please. Radio National and local radio on BBC.
Bless you.